What's up, quarantines? We're here today to talk briefly about Andrew Jackson's presidency. We're going to just list some straight up facts about Jackson, who he was, and what he did. I'm going to try and leave the assessment of who Andrew Jackson was and how he should be remembered to you. Remember in class when we talked about Andrew Jackson, we put him in the Hall of Fame or the Hall of Shame. You guys made posters and we had a discussion about how his legacy should be remembered and who he was and how he should kind of be placed in the Hall of Fame or the Hall of Shame when it comes to remembering history. So let's just really briefly talk about who he was and what he did. We're just going to kind of list some major parts of his presidency, and then you guys are gonna do your own judgments. And I might mention the word historiography later on. I don't know. Very exciting. So, Andrew Jackson became famous actually here in Florida fighting against indigenous people in the Seminole Wars. If you think about it, Jacksonville is actually named for Andrew Jackson. And he was famous as a general here during the Seminole Wars right here in Florida. He also gained some notoriety in the War of 1812, the Battle of New Orleans as a general, but he was really catapulted to the national stage during the presidential election of 1824. Keep in mind that the era of good feelings has been happening in all this time. There's only been one single political party dominating the American political landscape during the era of good feelings. The era of good feelings starts with the death of the Federalist Party at the end of the War of 1812, and it goes on throughout James Monroe's presidency until the election of 1824, when James Monroe does not run for a third term, and we have now 4 people running for president. And what happens with these 4 people running is none of them get enough votes to be considered president. Although Andrew Jackson wins the most popular votes, he does not secure the electoral vote, which means that the election is contested and it has to be decided in the House of Representatives. So there are 4 people running for president now, and the House of Representatives is going to have to decide who becomes president. Those 4 people are Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, and some other guy. And the reason why I say some other guy is because the action and the election of 1824 really happens between those 3 people, Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, and Henry Clay. Keep in mind, Henry Clay has a lot of power in Congress. We talked about his American system, the Missouri Compromise in 1820. And so Henry Clay, whenever the presidential election gets to the House of Representatives, Henry Clay actually withdraws his candidacy and throws his support behind John Quincy Adams in exchange for a cabinet position in John Quincy Adams' presidency. And Andrew Jackson flips out, right? Andrew Jackson calls this the corrupt bargain. He says that Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams, in a corrupt way, teamed up to lose Andrew Jackson the presidency, even though he technically won the most popular votes. And so Andrew Jackson becomes famous. Well, he was already famous because he was running for president. Non-famous people don't really run for president, generally. But Andrew Jackson maintains his notoriety by calling the election of 1824 the corrupt bargain, and by vowing to end that corruption if he can make it to the White House. So he runs again in 1828. And in this election, Andrew Jackson does prevail. He becomes president in 1828. But the election of 1828 is notable because even by today's standards, there was a ton of mudslinging done in that election, like making fun of each other's wives and moms and stuff like that. So, had substance for sure. But Andrew Jackson also ran, both John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson ran a pretty dirty campaign, like I said, even by today's standards, which is really saying something. But in this time period, Andrew Jackson is rising to the presidency at a time where the American political landscape is changing. Andrew Jackson is credited to ascending to the presidency at the time of this expanded democracy, this time of the common man. A lot of states have ended voting or property requirements in order to vote. So now if you are a white man, even if you're poor, even if you don't own land, now you can vote. So like universal white male suffrage is now a thing in most states. Additionally, nominating conventions have expanded. So previously, there was King Caucus, where caucuses would happen with just a small closed door meeting. And in Andrew Jackson's time period, those small closed door meetings opened up so that more people were able to get involved in the nominating process. Not to mention, there just is a growth in how many elected positions there are. Like, rather than there being one elected position and that one elected position appoints a bunch of other positions, now all of those cabinet positions now can be elected too. So what you see in a lot of states is just an expansion of the political process. There's a lot more opportunities for individual, like regular Joe Schmoes, to be involved in the political process. And so Andrew Jackson really takes advantage of that. He takes advantage of the idea that average everyday Joes are going to be voting and going to be involved in politics. And so Andrew Jackson really effectively capitalizes on that. He calls himself, he says he's going to be the champion of the common man. He's going to protect the average everyday regular citizen from the corrupted elite that is currently has a chokehold on the American political system. So Andrew Jackson becomes famous calling himself an advocate for the common man. And, one thing he does that is kind of aligned with that is he institutes the spoils system, in which he says, look, if you support me, if you work on my campaign, if you are a part of my party politics, you contribute to helping my party gain power, then I'm going to make sure you got a job somewhere in my government, in my cabinet. And that's interesting because rather than like having a job that people apply for or are qualified for, you get appointed to that job just because you did something to help out Jackson or the other elected official. And that's a kind of a democratic idea. It's not like I have to have a certain degree or have a certain amount of money or have a certain experience. Like, anybody can do that job if they have the opportunity to do it. So, again, Andrew Jackson is a complex legacy. And for all of these things that I'm listing and about to get into listing, I think there's a variety of ways you can remember who he was and what he did as a person. The spoils system is a great example of that. Is it something that's democratic, giving opportunity to more people? Or is it, just nepotism or giving jobs away to people who are loyal to you? Or is it a power move? Both of those things could be remembered, I think, in either way. Something that's a little bit more cut and dry for how he's remembered, though, is how Andrew Jackson treated the indigenous population of the United States. Jackson was very sympathetic to white landowners wanting to expand out west, and he got famous fighting against indigenous people in Florida in the Seminole Wars. However, as president, he expanded that fight into a legislative authority. So he passed the Indian Removal Act, which basically incentivized or coerced indigenous peoples off their land. A lot of indigenous people sued. Most notably, the Cherokee Nation was adept at getting recognition from the Supreme Court and getting their cases heard in the Supreme Court, where the court ruled in favor of Cherokee Nation. And so Andrew Jackson famously said, if the Supreme Court wants to enforce their ruling, let them. And so obviously the Supreme Court doesn't have the ability to enforce their rulings. That's actually the job of the presidency. And so Andrew Jackson continued on with the Indian Removal Act, even though he didn't necessarily have the constitutional authority to do so. And so what the Indian Removal Act is eventually going to lead to after Jackson leaves office is the Trail of Tears, which is a death march across the southern part of the United States to force indigenous people off their land, like by force with the U.S. military. So, the Indian Removal Act, Jackson's treatment of the indigenous people, I think that's a pretty cut and dry issue that his legacy is tarnished by that. But there were other ways that Jackson's legacy can be discussed outside his treatment of indigenous peoples. Like, for example, where he falls on states' rights is an interesting issue. And so in Jackson's presidency, he had this whole crisis of nullification involving South Carolina. And so this is a callback. We talked a long time ago about the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, which stated, this idea that the federal government doesn't have more power than state governments. State governments, since they're the They're the source of federal power. State governments are not powerless against the federal government. And if the federal government were to do something that acts against the best interest of the state, then the state government has the right to nullify or to ignore that federal law. And so basically that happened. South Carolina, remember, the South is an export-based economy. Protective tariffs are not always good for the Southern economy. In fact, usually they're bad for agricultural institutions. And so when protective tariffs were passed during Jackson's presidency, South Carolina called it the tariff of abominations, that's bad for us, that we are not going to follow that tariff. And South Carolina eventually said, you know what, we're going to pass legislation that says that that tariff is not going to be collected within the state of South Carolina, to which Andrew Jackson said, yes, it is. Andrew Jackson asserted federal law. He asserted the power of the federal government over state governments, even though Jackson's party, the Democrats, is going to be championed as a states' rights party, that he's supposed to be in favor of states' rights, but he is not. He draws a line at disunion. In fact, he formally drafts a resolution to call nullification a treasonous act. He also passes the force bill, in which he told Congress, we need to get ready to have military action against South Carolina to force them to follow this federal law. And so in this nullification crisis, eventually South Carolina is like, whoa, okay. And South Carolina backed down and said, okay, Jackson said, listen, maybe we can renegotiate some aspects of this tariff. And South Carolina says, okay, fine, let's sit down and talk about it. And so eventually the crisis ended pretty diplomatically in the end. But Jackson, before he had those diplomatic tendencies to sit down with South Carolina to change some aspects of the tariff to benefit the South Carolina economy, he was prepared to take military action to force the state of South Carolina to follow federal law. So that's an interesting part of Jackson's legacy. As a party of states' rights, as a party of the common man, the individual, always very pro-farmer, he acted in a way that was pretty aligned with this idea of a strong federal power, which was a Federalist idea. Speaking of the Federalists, they died with the War of 1812, but their ideas really lived on, and their idea of having a strong central government, of the government taking action to promote a manufacturing-based economy, those things lived on with Henry Clay, especially in the form of the American system during the era of good feelings. But in the election of 1824, an opposition party formally formed called the Whigs. John Quincy Adams was a Whig president. Henry Clay was also a Whig, as the man who withdrew his candidacy to support John Quincy Adams, who served in his cabinet and who is going to remain powerful in Congress as a Whig in opposition to Andrew Jackson, who is a Democrat, right? So now we've got this Democratic Party who Andrew Jackson is the champion of. He's the common man. He's pro-farmer, pro-states' rights. Andrew Jackson also, interestingly, he used his presidential power to stop anti-slavery information from being sent through the U.S. mail. So in that way, Andrew Jackson very much supported the South. Although he forced South Carolina to abandon nullification, to follow federal law, he also, Southern landowners knew that they had Jackson's support in maintaining the institution of slavery. So, you have this is what's shaping up, right? The Democratic Party is finding support in the South, finding support amongst this idea of states' rights, finding the support as kind of like a common man farming party. And the Whig Party, born from the Federalists, which was a Northeastern elitist party, the Whigs are very much becoming that. They're becoming a more manufacturing-oriented party, somebody who's going to support infrastructure, support a strong central government, support the federal government against states' rights. And so one big issue in those party politics is going to be the Bank of the United States, right? the Bank of the U.S., the issue that divides political parties to begin with. Remember, Jefferson is opposed to the Bank of the U.S. And Jackson is very much, he called himself a frugal Jeffersonian. That's Jefferson's party is now what Jackson is championing, a limited central government, more power to the states' governments, a strict interpretation of the Constitution. Jackson, in fact, takes that strict interpretation so far that he vetoes more legislation than any of the presidents before him combined. He actually had, and that's 12 vetoes, which is not that much by our modern standards, but he had 12 vetoes in his presidency because he's so convinced on limiting the power of the central government, because he's a strict constitutionalist. He did not believe that the federal government should be taking all of that extra power, should be doing all of that extra stuff. And so the opposition to Jackson's party, the Whigs, the idea that there's a loose interpretation of the Constitution, that we should have a government that is, expanding its power, doing what it needs to do to support the economy, to get the economy going, to have a national bank. And so Jefferson opposed to the national bank. And Madison, if you remember Jefferson's protege, allowed the bank to expire. However, Democrats under James Monroe rechartered the national bank for 20 years. Okay, so now we have a situation where the bank recharter is coming up. Whigs are in favor of the national bank. Henry Clay is championing the Whig Party in Congress. The national bank is being, this is now the second bank of the United States because it expired under Madison, was rechartered under Monroe. And the second bank of the United States is now run by this man named Nicholas Biddle and supported by the Whig Party, which means that Jackson doesn't like it. In fact, Jackson never liked the national bank. And if you remember, the national bank caused a panic in 1819. And there was one specific Western farmer who was negatively impacted by that panic of 1819. And that was Andrew Jackson. So he had been personally impacted by the national bank. He did not like the Bank of the United States. He was opposed to it. And he also really hated Nicholas Biddle specifically. He did not like that guy. He thought Nicholas Biddle was arrogant. And he also believed that, the national bank was like this Medusa of corruption, that if you cut the head off, 3 more will grow back. And he just thought that this national bank as like this elitist, corporation run, only benefits the wealthy institution that is just crippling the common man in America. And so Jackson, it was known that that he hated the national bank. So in the election year of 1832, Henry Clay, the leader of the Whig Party, thought it would be a good idea if he went ahead and applied and drafted legislation that would recharter the national bank 4 years before it was really up, before it was going to die, And he thought, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and we're going to pressure Andrew Jackson into supporting this national bank. It's an election year. Jackson is not going to risk killing the national bank in an election year because the national bank was a stabilizing force in the American economy. It was mostly a good thing, People mostly they were either ambivalent about it or they liked it, and it definitely did good things for the American economy. And so Clay thought there's no way Jackson would take such a strong political stand during an election year. He is not going to veto this bank now. So let's go ahead and draft legislation to recharter the national bank. Even though they don't have to, he just thinks now's the time. Looking forward, Jackson could veto it later because he has no political consequences if it's not an election year. So during this election year, let's draft this legislation. Let's make him recharter the national bank, and then that way we'll have it done already. Henry Clay was wrong. Jackson vetoed it and made this big scene about how, he's sticking up for the common man against this corporate elite. And he's doing the right thing. He's going to protect the average American Joe from like this awful institution, Bank of the U.S. And people were loving it, right? Jackson resoundingly won the election of 1832. Henry Clay did not. I mean, it was not a successful political move on his part. And so, he vetoed it. He did it. Now, that doesn't mean the bank's dead, because the bank still had 4 years left on its charter. So although he vetoed recharting the national bank, Andrew Jackson looked at that and said, you know what? I just vetoed the recharter of that bank, and the people loved me. They voted for me resoundingly. I won. So that tells Andrew Jackson, people don't like the bank. So he decides he's going to kill it. And so in his second term, Jackson kills the Bank of the U.S. And he does that by taking, by presidential unilateral, his presidential order executive action. He takes all of the federal money out of the Bank of the U.S. and puts them into a whole bunch of state banks. So let's pause for a second and think about his legacy. He's a Democrat. He's supposed to be a frugal Jeffersonian, pro states' rights. Yet he takes this unprecedented federal action. He's expanding the power of the presidency by unilaterally taking all the money out of those banks, but he's supporting states' rights by putting the money into state banks, which his critics called them pet banks. Like, oh, you just picked these pet banks, and now like those are the people. Those are the institutions that get the federal money. Like, not a good look if you're a critic of Jackson, but that's a far-reaching show of federal authority to unilaterally take this action. But is he doing it in the namesake of promoting states' rights in the long run? Because he kills the bank, right? That kills the bank. The bank's dead now. There's no money in it, And what this ended up actually doing, though, is sending the economy into disarray. We're talking about these financial actions are leading to land values and various goods becoming inflated because they don't have the currency stabilization of the national bank. And so Jackson tries to combat that by passing this thing called specie circular, which means that if you have federal land, it has to be purchased with silver or gold. That because banknotes are getting inflated, Jackson's trying to combat that inflation, and so federal land has to be bought with silver or gold specifically. That's what he called specie circular. But this made banknotes lose a whole bunch of value because you can't use banknotes to buy federal land anymore. And so all of this instability eventually sends the nation into the Panic of 1837, and then we spiral into a depression following that national depression. So, he kills the bank, but the far-reaching actions of that is like basically economic instability and national depression. But he is indeed, limiting the power of the federal government by eliminating the national bank to begin with. So again, it's a complicated legacy of Andrew Jackson. Do you remember him as the guy who championed states' rights, through his actions? Or do you look at him as somebody who is vastly expanding the power of the presidency through veto power, through Indian removal, ignoring the Supreme Court, through unilaterally ending the national bank, through the Force Bill, which ended nullification in South Carolina? It's an interesting legacy to discuss for sure. And rest assured that we will discuss his legacy more in our chat sessions. So hopefully whenever we get to that, you guys can use some of these like just straight up kind of events and facts about Andrew Jackson's presidency to discuss whether or not we think, was he a Democrat? Was he a Whig in disguise? Should his legacy be celebrated? Should he be in the Presidential Hall of Shame? Man, what interesting historical questions. And I would even venture to mention that Jackson's legacy is going to remember differently by people who studied history in different times. We're living in a world right now in the year 2000 and, 20, I guess, when, we have access to all of these narratives online. And so we think about Andrew Jackson's presidency from the perspective of an indigenous individual. That's going to be an obvious answer. We think about Andrew Jackson's presidency from the perspective of the common, everyday, average Western farmer. We can do that too. And so we're at a position in our historiographical studies where we can think critically about Andrew Jackson's presidency and really decide, who did he benefit? From what perspective was he a successful president? And from what perspective was he maybe not so much successful? Okay. So looking forward to continuing this discussion with you guys in our online chat. And I hope that you guys are safe out there in these crazy times. And I'm also looking forward to the day when I discuss the historiography of months-long quarantine due to the coronavirus. So, interesting time we're living in, guys. Don't forget to document it. Be safe. Later.